Good evening, everyone. Tonight's speaker event is being recorded. My name is Emily Spence, and I am the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome, and thank you for attending and supporting tonight's talk. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our friends at Hubtown Tours for their continued support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, and nor should their stories and memories. We have one more speaker series event planned for this summer. On July 16th, Dr. Alexandria Russell will be speaking on her book, Black Women Legacies, and in particular, we'll be focusing on the memorialization of Phyllis Wheatley by Black women throughout history. We also have a great lineup of speaker series events coming this fall, including another book chat on Johnny Tremaine with Loyalist historian Patrick O'Brien, and a talk on the revolution in music, as well as other topics. So please stay tuned for more information about our fall lineup. And of course, if you find yourself in the North End this summer, we hope you will visit Old North. We have a brand new exhibit that just opened about the history of childhood in Boston's North End called Unearthing Childhood, 300 Years of North End Kids. So we hope you'll come check that out. And now I'd like you to imagine that you are at Old North and that you have just pushed open the weathered doors that lead into the crypt beneath the church. It's quite cool beneath the crypt, which is a nice welcome respite from the 100-degree weather we're having here in Boston. If you look to your right and see a tomb, you'll see a tomb covered by an old wooden door. To the right of that door is a slate plate carved with the name Major John Pitcairn. Major Pitcairn was a British Marine and was with the British soldiers as they charged up the hill at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was mortally wounded at that battle and is buried at Old North. Or is he? Here to help us untangle this mystery and others surrounding the life and death of Major John Pitcairn is historian J.L. Bell. J.L. Bell is a Massachusetts writer who specializes in, among other things, the start of the American Revolution in and around Boston. He is particularly interested in the experiences of children in 1765 to 1775. He is the proprietor of the popular blog Boston 1775 and the author of The Road to Concord: How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. He has published scholarly papers and popular articles for both children and adults, including Peter Salem, Salem Poor, Who Killed Major John Pitcairn, in the Journal of the American Revolution. We are so delighted to have him with us tonight. And now I will remind you to please mute your microphones and put any questions you have in the chat. There will be some time at the end for John to answer your questions. And now I will turn it over to you, John. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to Emily, thank you to Catherine, thank you to Nikki and everybody at Old North Illuminated for allowing me to go into the depths of the church like this. Tonight I'm going to talk about how the spirit of Major John Pitcairn has hovered over stories of the Revolutionary War, which is, of course, our big American origin story. Now, I'm not talking about a real ghost, if such a thing exists, but I'm talking about a sort of cultural ghost, the idea of Major Pitcairn, and what he represented in New England culture in 1775 and in the centuries that followed. How his memory was important for what it represented and what meanings people could draw from how he lived and how he died. And I'll start with a fact about the real man. Who was John Pitcairn? This is the standard portrait of Major Pitcairn, and it's very iffy. John Pitcairn was born in 1722, so he is 53 years old when the war began. Obviously, this is a picture of a young man, but the uniform that this man is wearing doesn't fit the era in which Pitcairn was a young officer. It doesn't even fit the era of the Revolution. So one possibility is that this was a posthumous painting of Pitcairn as a young man put into the Marines uniform of the time when it was made. Or it could show somebody entirely different in the Pitcairn family and they just got mixed up. There are so many anomalies about that common image that at last weekend's 250th anniversary reenactment of Bunker Hill, they created and displayed this image. This is definitely not Pitcairn's face. It was created through AI. It's not his uniform, but it's at least closer to the veteran officer that we should picture. As I said, John Pitcairn was 53 years old in 1775. He was the son of a minister. He had served in the Marines for 30 years. He had married a woman named Elizabeth Dalrymple, and they had 10 children, 8 of them still living in 1775, but the youngest was still of school age. Among the sons, Robert Pitcairn had joined the Navy and been lost at sea. Thomas had joined the Royal Artillery, and William had followed his father into the Marines. And in fact, both Thomas and William were serving in Boston in 1775. In 1775, Major John Pitcairn was the highest ranking officer of the British Marines in Boston. The Marines were a wing of the Royal Navy. They fought with their muskets in naval battles. They made raids on shore. And in Boston, most of the 700 or so Marines were stationed on shore alongside the regiments of the British Army. Pitcairn, in fact, wanted all the Marines on shore under his command, and he was complaining about that to his boss, that the admiral was keeping some of them still on the ships. The enlisted men in the Marines lived in barracks in the North End. And to us, those Marines would have looked a lot like redcoats in the Army. They wore red coats with white facings, as in these paintings from the period. To tell the difference between Marines and regular soldiers, you had to spot the lack of ornamental stitching around the buttonholes and other bits of what military tailors called lace. And likewise, there weren't a lot of differences in insignias among the officers. So really, you had to know which officer was which in order to know how they ranked next to each other, and that would become significant. I went looking for evidence of how Bostonians responded to Pitcairn's arrival, and there was barely a mention in the newspapers. The local press reprinted a British newspaper item about Pitcairn's corps being sent to Boston, and then they reported when they arrived, and nothing else. Pitcairn doesn't make any appearance in the Diary of John Roe, in the letters of John Andrews, in other standard sources where I go to look for details about life in revolutionary Boston. We have only one anecdote, really, about Major Pitcairn's time in Boston, and it wasn't published until 1847 in a biography of an American businessman and diplomat named Samuel Shaw. That book, written by the Quincy family, revealed that Pitcairn and another Marine officer, Lieutenant John Wragg, had rented rooms in Shaw's father's house. Or rather, that book suggested that the Shaw family had been required to provide rooms for the officers, but that's not how quartering really worked in this time. Officers rented space from willing hosts. According to this biography, 20-year-old Samuel Shaw was a much more vocal patriot than his father, whose name doesn't show up in connection with any of the political activities in the decade leading up to the war. Samuel Shaw, the son, took offense at Lieutenant Wragg calling the colonists cowards and rebels. And that situation might have been moving toward a duel, according to this book, when Major Pitcairn stepped in and told the younger officer to calm down. Now, interestingly, here's some of what Major Pitcairn himself wrote back to his boss, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Sandwich, in February. The deluded people are made to believe that they are invincible. When this army is ordered to act against them, they will soon be convinced that they are very insignificant when opposed to regular troops. We have no orders to do what I wish to do, and what I think may easily be done. I mean to seize them all and send them to England. And then in March, Major Pitcairn wrote, orders are anxiously expected from England to chastise these very bad people. I am satisfied that one active campaign, a smart action, and burning 2 or 3 of their towns will set everything to rights. The people behaved as I suppose they will ever do. They made a great noise when there is nobody to oppose them, but the moment they see us in arms and in earnest, they will talk very differently. So it wasn't that Pitcairn was disagreeing with Lieutenant Wragg, calling the colonists cowards and rebels. He actually sort of felt the same way, and most of the British officers in town did. He just was being more polite about it. Major Pitcairn got his wish for action finally in April 1775. the royal governor and army commander, General Thomas Gage, planned an expedition to search for cannons and other military supplies in Concord, and he made Pitcairn the second in command of that force. It was elite troops, 700 light infantrymen and grenadiers. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith was the top commander on the march, and he put Pitcairn in charge of the vanguard, the troops at the front. The major and some other officers and scouts were there on horseback. Now, by the time the column reached the outskirts of Lexington, they knew that the countryside was being alarmed. They were hearing bells, they were hearing warning shots. Smith told Pitcairn to lead 6 light infantry companies ahead to Concord as quickly as possible to seal off that town. Along the way, the officers saw a local fire a gun, so Pitcairn ordered the soldiers to load their muskets. But he also said he cautioned them not to fire first. Those troops marched quickly into Lexington at dawn. The front company, the light infantry of the 10th Regiment, saw about 70 local militiamen lined up with their guns on the town common, facing broadside against the road leading on to Concord. And at least the same number of other militiamen were milling around the Buckman Tavern close by. So 2 or 3 of those companies of light infantrymen marched onto the common and lined up against the militia line. Major Pitcairn rode forward to catch up with those men. According to people from Lexington, British officers started yelling at the militiamen. Different witnesses recalled the words slightly differently. Lay down your arms, damn you. Why don't you lay down your arms? Throw down your arms, ye villains, ye rebels. Disperse, ye rebels, immediately. Ye villains, ye rebels, disperse, damn you, disperse. The militia line did start to disperse, but they didn't leave their muskets behind, and then a shot rang out. The British soldiers started to fire at the militia and chase them away. And within a minute, 7 men from Lexington died, as well as 1 from Woburn, and 10 more were wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Smith arrived from back in the pack and ordered a drummer to play the signal to assemble, and that restored order among the soldiers, which suggests that Pitcairn hadn't been able to restore order himself. Soon the British column marched on to Concord, because that was the goal of their mission, to get to Concord as fast as possible. In the days that followed, Simon Winship described an officer at the head of said troops flourishing his sword and with a loud voice giving the word fire. And John Robbins of Lexington testified, the foremost of the 3 officers ordered their men saying, fire, by God, fire. And 2 more quoted the commanding officer saying, fire, fire, damn you, fire. And another pair of men even said that some of the regulars on horses, whom we took to be officers, fired a pistol or two on the Lexington company, which was then dispersing. These were the first guns that were fired. So all these local men blamed the British officer commanding on the common, Major Pitcairn, for ordering the soldiers to fire and for firing his gun himself. Pitcairn's own report to Gage said, I instantly called the soldiers not to fire, but surround and disarm them. And after several repetitions, some of the rebels who had jumped over the wall fired 4 or 5 shots at the soldiers, which wounded a man of the 10th, and my horse was wounded in 2 places from some quarter or other. Without any order or regularity, the light infantry began a scattered fire, and continued in that situation for some little time, contrary to the repeated orders both of me and the officers that were present. Now, my mission tonight is not to sort out the conflicting accounts, with each side insisting that the other had clearly fired first and that their side was blameless. Rather, I'm focusing on how that fatal encounter on Lexington Common made Major Pitcairn an important figure in local history and thus in national history. He was the man in charge of the British troops when they killed local men. Many witnesses there quoted that commanding officer as saying, damn you, fire, showing hostility, and of course profanity could still be shocking in the New England countryside. Later that morning, the regulars arrived at Concord, and as shown in this second picture by Ralph Earl and Amos Doolittle, Lieutenant Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn went up on the hill that Concord used as its burying ground to oversee the troops searching the whole town for weapons. According to General Gage, during those hours, the people at Concord were sulky, and one of them even struck Major Pitcairn. As soon as people learned that Major Pitcairn was the commanding officer during the skirmish at Lexington, he became significant in Americans' eyes. He had meaning. He became a character in the stories that New Englanders were telling each other. And of course, his meaning for the patriots of New England at this time was as a villain. 1 year after the battle, the Reverend William Emerson of Concord sermonized, "What bold blaspheming speeches rushed from the cursing lips of the intemperate Pitcairn, who, like the Assyrian chief, blasphemed our God and cause, that made the boldest of our sinners tremble." In 1835, a local historian, Lemuel Shattuck, wrote, "At Wright's Tavern, Pitcairn called for a glass of brandy and stirred it with his bloody finger, remarking that he hoped he should stir the damned Yankee blood so before night." And a man named Tilly Merrick later claimed that at his mother's house, Major Pitcairn spotted an enslaved man standing with his hands behind him, and as he did on the rebels at Lexington Common a few hours previously, the major pointed a pistol at the man's head and ordered him to give up his arms. And the man raised his empty hands and said these were the only arms he had. Now, that story might have been no more than a joke, but it shows the persona that the culture had assigned to Pitcairn already. He was profane, he was violent, he was oppressive. Yet another story arose about Pitcairn as the British force withdrew from Concord back to Boston. And it seemed to have arisen very early, possibly on the day of the battle, but it first appeared in a book in 1818, which said, "It was Pitcairn who caused the first effusion of blood at Lexington. In that battle, his horse was shot under him. While he was separated from his troops, with presence of mind, he feigned himself slain. His pistols were taken from his holsters, and he was left for dead, when he seized the opportunity and escaped." And then in 1827, the Reverend Ezra Ripley of Concord provided more detail. "When the enemy were rising Fisk's Hill in the west part of Lexington, they were very hardly pressed, the Americans having run forward and placed themselves advantageously behind trees and fences. The British faced about, and in a very spirited and bloody contest ensued. Here Major Pitcairn was wounded and unhorsed. His horse, pistols, etc. were taken. The horse was taken to Concord and sold at auction. Captain Nathan Barrett bought the pistols and afterwards offered them to General Washington, but he not accepting them, they were given to General Israel Putnam. The Putnam family periodically brought those pistols back to Massachusetts to display them and finally donated them to the Lexington Historical Society. They were displayed for many years as the Pitcairn pistols. Then curators noticed that the crest engraved on the pistols wasn't the Pitcairn family crest. In 2009, a British Army reenactor named Mike Monahan alerted me to that anomaly, and so I did some research, which basically meant Googling for the family crest with snakes and swords. And I found that the crest on these pistols was actually from the Crosby family. And there was a British Army officer named Crosby on the expedition to Concord, Captain William Crosby of the Grenadier Company of the 38th Regiment. And since then, those pistols have been displayed in Lexington and at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia as the Crosby pistols. So what does this little episode tell us about the figure of Major Pitcairn and how he hung over New Englanders? Locals wanted revenge. Locals wanted this haughty British officer who caused the first infusion of blood at Lexington to be brought low. Having his horse wounded wasn't enough. Having General Gage have to complain about somebody in Concord striking him wasn't enough. This story about Major Pitcairn being knocked to the ground, perhaps having to play dead and run away, losing his horse and his fancy pistols, that was a more satisfying tale. So, of course, if a British officer lost his pistols in the battle, people wanted that man to be Major Pitcairn. They decided it was Major Pitcairn. These became the Pitcairn pistols. We can see the same story, even bigger, in American reports of the Battle of Bunker Hill 2 months later. This was the first pitched battle of the Revolutionary War and the first defeat for the Provincial Army. For the British forces, it was an immensely costly victory with over 1,000 casualties. Very early on, New Englanders learned that Major Pitcairn had died of his wounds from that battle. Just 5 days afterwards, the New England Chronicle newspaper reported that a great many other officers are dead, but that newspaper named only one casualty. The only name was among the dead was Major Pitcairn. Now, at that time, Pitcairn was the British force's highest ranking death, so he was prominent in that way. But even after Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie succumbed to his wounds a few days later and became the highest ranking death, locals focused on Pitcairn because his death meant the most. Now, Pitcairn's death also had deep meaning for the British. General John Burgoyne wrote home, Major Pitcairn was a brave and good man. His son, an officer in the same corps, and near him when he fell, carried his expiring father upon his back to the boats about a quarter of a mile, kissed him, and instantly returned to his duty. This circumstance in the hands of a good painter or historian would equal most that can be found in antiquity. Burgoyne, who is also a playwright, was turning the Major's dying into art. Newspapers in Britain told more stories. One letter from Boston said that Lieutenant William Pitcairn was standing by his father when that noble officer fell, cried out, My father is killed! I have lost my father! This slackened the firing of our corps for some minutes, many of the men echoing the words, We have all lost a father! Another report from the Pitcairn family's home base in Chatham said, On the news being brought to his lady, she immediately dropped down, and for several hours it was thought she was dead. She has not spoke since, and her life is not expected. I'm pleased to report that Elizabeth Pitcairn lived almost 35 more years. Newspapers also said that the government granted her a pension, and Lieutenant Pitcairn, the son who had been carried his father from the battle and had been wounded in that same battle, he was promoted as an acknowledgement of the services of his gallant father. So the British government, the British society, treated Pitcairn's loss as a tragedy and tried to make it right for the family. Americans also took note of Pitcairn's death, of course. He is as one of the British officers dying in John Trumbull's death of General Warren. But the story that resonated most strongly in American culture, the one that held the most meaning, was about who fired the fatal musket ball at Major Pitcairn. As early as 1780, a black man named Isaac Freeman petitioned the Massachusetts legislature, stating that your memorialist was a happy man, though a poor Negro, that put an end to the life of that bold and, of course, dangerous man, Major Pitcairn, with 8 or 9 others that day, besides wounding a number of other villains. That petition's language, it's florid, it's hard to believe, frankly. This one man was claiming to wound over a dozen of the enemy. The legislature granted Freeman only £5 in inflation-rattled wartime currency, but the Boston Gazette printed his petition, perhaps just for the literary style. And that is the first claim we have of an individual killing Major Pitcairn. In 1787, the Reverend Dr. Jeremy Belknap, the founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, took notes on several details of the Battle of Bunker Hill, including, quote, a Negro man belonging to Groton took aim at Major Pitcairn as he was rallying the dispersed British troops and shot him through the head. He was brought over to Boston and died as he was landing on the ferryways. This account conflicts with some details from the time. For instance, there was only one black soldier from Groton in the battle, Barzillai Lew, and he never claimed to have shot Pitcairn. Also, the major didn't die just after landing in Boston. He lingered a while, but clearly there was a story going around that a black soldier had killed Pitcairn. And then in 1818, the first major historian of Bunker Hill, Samuel Swett, wrote, among the first to mount the works, the gallant Major Pitcairn exultingly cried, the day is ours, when a black soldier named Salem shot him through, and he fell. His agonized son received him in his arms and tenderly bore him to the boats. A few years later, in an expanded edition, Swett added that his source also said, a contribution was made in the army for Salem, and he is presented to Washington as having shot Pitcairn. Thus, we have 2 early and apparently independent sources attributing Pitcairn's death to an African-American soldier. In 1826, a chronicler of the town of Leicester wrote, there was residing here, till a few years back, a black man who we have good reason to believe was the one who shot Major Pitcairn. However, the only reason to believe that the author provided was that that man was named Salem, matching what was in Swett's essay. This man is Peter Salem. Now, Peter Salem himself never claimed to have shot the major, but still that claim was enough to inspire illustrations like this one, which first appeared in William Cooper Nell's The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution in 1855, and was reprinted as late as 1890 in Edward Johnson's A School History of the Negro Race in America. And we can see that this engraving was derived from John Trumbull's painting, with the focus shifted away from Warren to Pitcairn in the center and Peter Salem at the right, brought out from behind a white officer. However, there were other black men named Salem in the provincial forces. In particular, Salem Poor of Andover was praised in 1775 by 13 Continental Army officers and a brigade surgeon for having, in the late Battle of Charlestown, behaved like an experienced officer as well as an excellent soldier. This brave and gallant soldier deserved a reward, they told the Massachusetts legislature in the petition that you see on the left here. Unfortunately, the men signing that document also wrote, to set forth particulars of his conduct would be tedious. To which I say, as a historical researcher, no, it wouldn't be tedious at all. Set forth the particulars. But of course, they didn't do that. I think it's quite possible that those officers saw Salem Poor remaining in the provincial redoubt during the final British assault and believed that he had shot Major Pitcairn. Thus, we have two sources, apparently independent of each other, saying that an African-American soldier shot Pitcairn, and another source from the year of the battle singling out an African-American soldier for exceptional service in the battle, and we have this name Salem. And that's not all. When I researched Major Pitcairn's death for an article a decade ago, I found 5 other stories about who fired the fatal shot, most of them white soldiers. And since that article, I came across another claim for a captain. But it was the image of an African-American soldier shooting Major Pitcairn that stuck in our culture. And not just because of the early documentation for it. Abolitionists like William Cooper Nell and George Livermore used that story as evidence of Black patriotism and military prowess. The image also resonated outside of activist circles. This version was published by the engraver and chronicler Benson J. Lossing after emancipation, and he captioned this dramatic picture, "The shooting of Major Pitcairn, who had shed the first blood at Lexington by the colored soldier Salem." Lossing thus linked Pitcairn's actions in Lexington, where he is supposedly responsible for killing 8 men, with his own death 2 months later. The implication was that his death was some sort of cosmic retribution. And likewise, many of the authors who told stories about Pitcairn in April, such as the one about stirring his bloody finger in brandy, made sure to remind readers that the major was to die 2 months later. This was part of the meaning of Major Pitcairn's death. This cruel, haughty, profane man got his comeuppance. A black man, a lowly figure in American culture in those times, brought down this British oppressor just when he thought he had triumphed. But that's not what really happened. Our best source on how Major Pitcairn died are 2 letters from another British Marine officer, Lieutenant John Waller. He was adjutant of the battalion, thus Pitcairn's closest aide, and Waller told his brother that Major Pitcairn was killed close by me. And where was that? Well, the Marines had reached, quote, the talus of the redoubt, at the bottom of which was a road with hedges and trees on each side, besides a low stone wall, on the part of which we were jumbled together. That was at the bottom of the rise up Breed's Hill. There was a very severe and heavy fire from the enemy in the redoubt, and Pitcairn was hit. And then Waller wrote, "We remained about 10 minutes or near a quarter of an hour in this dangerous situation. And only after that did the Marines move on. We mounted the hedges without firing a shot and ran directly up the talus, got into the ditch, and mounted the parapet." Then Waller listed other officers who died at that spot. My dear and amiable friend Archie Campbell, poor Ellis, Shea, Lieutenant Ragg, who had shared quarters with Pitcairn in the Shaw House, was wounded at the end of that attack. Thus, we know that Pitcairn was not shot on the rim of the redoubt, but at the bottom of the rise to that wall. When he fell, the Marines still had to cross the hedges and the talus and the ditch and the parapet. Furthermore, those men were pinned down on that spot for 10 to 15 minutes. That was the time when Lieutenant William Pitcairn started to carry his father back to the waterside. It wasn't the end of the battle. It wasn't the climax. Lieutenant Waller's letters means that none of the American stories of Major Pitcairn being shot down on the redoubt wall is reliable. Furthermore, another of the earliest descriptions of Pitcairn's death by the Reverend John Eliot in a 1775 almanac also contradicts the standard story. Eliot wrote that Pitcairn received 4 balls in his body, and that would mean that Pitcairn was struck by multiple shooters, not just one man. Other British officers were definitely shot as they mounted the wall of the redoubt. One of them, quite possibly, was shot by Salem Poor. But it was hard to tell one British military officer from another. The uniforms weren't distinct enough. People didn't know their faces. But Americans wanted a meaningful victory. They wanted Pitcairn to be laid low at his moment of triumph. They wanted a lowly man to strike him down, and it makes a better story for how one man to fire the fatal shot than a whole bunch. So provincials convinced themselves that one of those officers killed on the lip of the redoubt was the infamous Major Pitcairn. And that story has struck around because it's more dramatic, it's more poetic, it's more emotional than what the best historical evidence says. So that is one way that the ghost of Major Pitcairn still hovers over the history, even though the actual man and his actual corpse do not. I'm now going to come to the part of this talk where we move from drama to farce. After the battle, Major Pitcairn's body and the body of some other British officers were placed in the crypt of Christ Church in the North End. And this placement reflected the men's religion. They were presumed to be part of the empire's established church. It reflected their class. Crypts and family tombs were more genteel than graves. And it might also, in this case, reflect geography, that Major Pitcairn had been living in the North End, probably going to this church, and he died in the North End, so it was the simplest, easiest thing to do. And Pitcairn's body stayed in the North Church through the British military evacuation and the rest of the war. His story continued to resonate in American culture after the war as well. People began to visit sites from the war, particularly Bunker's Hill. And I now have to introduce the figure of Ephraim Elliott, born in 1761. Ephraim was the son of the Reverend Andrew Elliott, minister of the New North Meeting House in Boston, another meeting place in the North End. Ephraim went to Harvard College during the Revolutionary War, and this is a page from his arithmetic notes. Then he went into medicine, becoming an apothecary and the first president of the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy. But for our purposes in studying history, what's most important about Dr. Ephraim Elliott is that he loved to gossip. And in print, he wrote useful profiles of his fellow medical practitioners, for instance. And here's a page from an 1821 book about the North End's meeting houses. And the margins of the copy, at the bottom you can see this copy, now in Harvard Library, Elliott recorded stories about the ministers in the book. And usually those were far less flattering stories than what was in print. For example, this page says about the Reverend Samuel Checkley, "For eating, he was the largest man in Boston, and his mouth was always full, and his jaw going with not preaching. My father used to say he hated to preach after Dr. Checkley, on account of the cracking of raisin seeds under his feet, with which the floor of the pulpit was always covered." One of the topics that Dr. Ephraim Elliott wrote about was the body of Major John Pitcairn. So he's my main source for the rest of this talk, but he's not the only one. I've been able to calibrate a lot of what he says with other sources. The Elliott family apparently knew Major Pitcairn and liked him. Months after the Major's death, Ephraim's older brother John called him an amiable and gallant officer, which that phrase was a cliche, but of course it's a positive cliche. According to Dr. Elliott, in the cellar of Christ Church were deposited the remains of many British officers, some of whom had died of sickness and others mortally wounded in battle. Among these was the brave Major Pitcairn of the Royal Marines. Elliott went on to say, "The Major was a very large and stout man. He was well known to the inhabitants of Boston, and notwithstanding the errand he was sent here upon, such were his gentlemanlike deportment, he had their respect. The sexton of the church, taking advantage of this disposition in the people, used to show a set of human bones in a very large coffin, as those of the Major." That sexton was probably Robert Newman, best remembered today as one of the 2 men who hung the signal lanterns in the Old North steeple on April 18th, 1775. Elliott called Newman as great a villain as ever went unhung. He didn't go into detail about why he felt that way about the man, but it probably has something to do with accepting tips to show visitors Major Pitcairn's body. According to Eliot, Pitcairn's body was easily confused with that of a lieutenant in the major's battalion, which was much like the major in size and shape. Eliot said that the Marine lieutenant died of an inflammation of the brain, so he was buried with a large blister plaster upon the head. But at some point, one of Eliot's own friends had removed that plaster, meaning that there was less to differentiate the two bodies. And that's when a man named Dr. Amos Winship enters the story. Eliot had a lot to say about Winship, and I'm passing on only a fraction of that gossip. Winship was a social climber with a habit of attaching himself to important people and then botching those relationships. In his early 20s, Winship attended Harvard College, but he left suddenly after an upperclassman accused him of theft. Then he apprenticed with doctors in Hingham and Nantucket. Winship was inside Boston when the war began, and according to Ephraim Eliot, in the disguise of a sailor with his head shaved and covered with a milled cap, he escaped in the weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And indeed, on July 21st, General Washington wrote to the Congress about receiving a more authentic account of the loss of the enemy in the late battle than any yet received. His new informant, Dr. Winship, had lodged in the same house with an officer of the Marines. And that information about British casualties that Dr. Winship had brought out of Boston was quite accurate. Winship went on to work as a surgeon at the Continental Army Hospital in Cambridge, attaching himself to the Surgeon General, Dr. Benjamin Church. That became awkward when Dr. Church was exposed as corresponding with the enemy and locked up in the hospital. But Dr. Winship soldiered on. In 1777, his life intersected with Abigail Adams. She had agreed to rent out the Adams family home in Boston to a newspaper printer, but when that man went to the house, he found the famous Dr. Winship living there and refusing to leave for several weeks. 2 years later, John Adams was sailing to Europe on a Navy ship as a diplomat for the Continental Congress, and who turned out to be the surgeon on that ship but Dr. Winship. The doctor buttered Adams up by telling him how other people were saying nasty things about him, something which Adams was very quick to believe. And in 1780, Dr. Winship promised to carry a chest of cloth and other goods back to Braintree for Mrs. Adams. In November 1780, Abigail wrote to John, "Dr. Winship neither came in the vessel nor sent me the things. I am not without fear that they will be embezzled." The next year, Dr. Winship and those goods did finally arrive by way of Philadelphia, but the cloth turned out to be wet and mildewed, and the doctor's explanation was hard to follow. Near the end of the war, Winship got involved with his brother-in-law in a shady deal to ship whale oil to London. But that didn't work out. But by pleading an indisposition, Dr. Winship got to meet a prominent Quaker physician named Dr. John Copley Lettsom. And Winship kept up his correspondence with Dr. Lettsom after returning to Boston. In May 1787, Dr. Winship became a warden of Christ Church, and he was particularly active in keeping the accounts. And of course, being a church warden gave him a respectable place in Boston society. Dr. Winship's friend, Dr. Lettsom, offered to get him into the London Medical Society if he demonstrated his learning. Remember, he had trained as an apprentice, not attending college or medical school, so he had to prove himself. Winship sent Lettsom a clinical report on an unusual dissection, which Lettsom then read at a society meeting in London in March 1788. Eventually, when that report of that meeting was printed in the proceedings and came back to America, another physician in Boston recognized the patient as someone he had treated and described in a paper for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 1790, Dr. Winship told the administrators of Harvard College that he'd been forced to withdraw after his freshman year under the direction of his guardian. In fact, Winship had been of legal age when he was at the college in the 1760s, and he withdrew because of that accusation of theft. Nonetheless, the college looked at his war record and his what looked like a successful career and granted him the degrees of Bachelor of Physics and Master of Arts in June 1790. So the newly credentialed Dr. Winship visited London again that year. His friend Dr. Lettsom introduced him to two even more prominent physicians, Dr. William Pitcairn and Dr. David Pitcairn. These men were the older brother of Major Pitcairn and the major's oldest son. They were treating members of the royal family. They were really as high in ranks of British surgeons as you could get. Winship no doubt told the Pitcairns how he had shared a house with Marine officers back in 1775, how he was now warden of the church in which Major Pitcairn's body lay. In fact, he told Lettsom that the stone vault in the cold climate of Boston had so preserved the corpse as to enable him to recognize Major Pitcairn's features. Dr. Lettsom wrote to a friend in July 1791, "Thou must remember the affair of Bunker's Hill last war, when Major Pitcairn fell. A friend of mine, lately at my house on a visit from Boston, was a particular acquaintance of the Major's, and this officer was beloved by all parties. My friend loved him as a father, although he is an American born and bred. The Major received 30 balls through his body. He was brought into Boston and buried in the King's Church, in a vault by himself, in a closed coffin, in his regimentals, and is at this moment in a perfect state. I informed Doctors Pitcairn, the father, the brother, and the son of the circumstance, who requested my friend to send the Major to England." So according to Ephraim Elliott, Winship offered to superintend the removal of the Major's coffin and its contents if it would afford any satisfaction to his friends. The Pitcairns, including the Major's widow, were pleased. So Dr. Winship went back to Boston. He took one very large coffin out of the crypt at Christ Church, put it into a box labeled organ, and shipped it to London. The Pitcairn family had the body placed in a tomb at St. Bartholomew's the Less Church, where eventually the two Dr. Pitcairns were also interred. Meanwhile, however, back in Boston, Dr. Winship had gotten himself in trouble with Christ Church. In 1791, he borrowed the church treasurer's ledger. When he gave it back, pew number 30, which had been reserved for the use of the royal governor, was now assigned to Dr. Winship. 2 pages had apparently been treated with some form of acid to erase the writing. The church was ready to go to court over this. That September, Dr. Winship admitted to the body that he had made an error in judgment, for which I am very sorry. He left Christ Church and started to attend the new brick meeting house instead. But by that time, the corpse of had already been removed from the crypt and sent over to the Pitcairns. Ephraim Elliott believed that Dr. Winship had sent the wrong body. He wrote, "The probability was that the bones were those of the lieutenant of the Major's battalion, who was much like the Major in size and shape." Elliott blamed Robert Newman for misleading Winship. Of course, Winship had assured his contacts in London that he could recognize Pitcairn's perfectly preserved features, and now he had a track record for bending facts, trying shady deals, and screwing up, so it would be perfectly in character for him to have mixed up the bodies. And also, frankly, some blame belongs to Dr. Ephraim Elliott's friend, the man who removed the plaster from the lieutenant's corpse. And that had been apparently the best way to differentiate the two corpses. And once that was gone, they were easy to mix up. Personally, I think that if there were 2 indistinguishable corpses in the crypt, the odds were 50-50 that Winship chose the right one. Dr. Elliott preferred to believe that Winship had definitely botched the job because that fit his story better. It gave his gossip more meaning. It's also possible that at least this one time, Dr. Winship got it right. A travel book published in 1807 reported that the Christ Church tomb in which were deposited the remains of the gallant Pitcairn was empty. But the crypt still had many skeletons, relics of some who held commands under the Major. On one of them hung the remains of regimentals and a pair of leather breeches in high preservation. The flesh of the body was entirely decayed. Another presented a fractured bone, and the whole formed a painful picture of mortality. The effect it produces on the spectator is so much the more powerful, as these bodies are not deposited in coffins, but lie exposed one upon another in the vault without any further covering. Gallant but unfortunate men. So even after Major Pitcairn had been removed, or at least assumed to be removed, his memory continued to haunt the church. These were men who served under Pitcairn because Pitcairn was the man whose meaning still lingered in American culture and was still haunting our local history. So that is how I believe Major Pitcairn might be in the crypt in Old North Church, or he might be at St. Bartholomew's the Less Church in London, and we really don't know. So thank you very much for coming with me on this journey, and I'd be happy to take questions of any sort.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll kind of field them over to you. Yeah, just thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I guess I will start off with a question that I have, and just something that struck me listening to your presentation and anytime I'm reading your blog is just the incredible amount of sources and primary sources that you find. I mean, just the amount that was in this presentation, the various quotes that you were sharing. Where do you go to find your sources for those of us who also do research? Where do you find your sources?
Well, as with the Pitcairn pistols, I start off with Googling. And it is just wonderful to have to start doing historical research in this period when so much is online. And because we're looking at things about the Revolutionary War, which is a lot of people have published about it over the years, there are a lot of sources to look for. Dr. Ephraim Elliott's manuscript about Amos Winship was published in the 1920s by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, which is headquartered on Beacon Hill, and so that's a terrific source. And then I could go to newspapers in newspaper databases and British sources. Because Dr. Winship has that Harvard degree, even if it's a bit iffy, he is documented that way through the university. So it's actually, although there was a lot of work, because of the cultural importance of Major Pitcairn and his body, there are a lot of sources to find.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I can see we have some questions coming in. All right, so first question is, has DNA analysis along with descendants ever been contemplated to prove if the body in the crypt belongs to Pitcairn? I guess I can answer that from Old Norse perspective, and maybe you know something more about the St. Bartholomew's. But from Old Norse, we have never done any sort of DNA analysis. You know, the question came up a couple of years ago when the crypt was being restored, but because it is still an active church and an active burial site with the columbarium, we felt that it was important to not disturb those remains. Those people were buried there as a religious space, and so we try to respect that and not disturb it in any way. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, John.
One curious wrinkle about this is that when I was doing this research first a few years ago, there was a Pitcairn family website, which actually they were dubious about Major Pitcairn being buried in London because there's not a record of a funeral for him there. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, he had already had a funeral. He had been dead for 15 years. So I don't think they would have necessarily had a funeral or anything. And it's quite clear from the letter of Dr. Letzum and other accounts of the time that people at the time certainly believed he had been sent over. But there is a bit of doubt within the Pitcairn family, the modern Pitcairn family, that his body was ever sent over. I think that in order to do the research, you'd have to do the genealogy, find out if there is indeed you'd have to get the samples of different DNA samples, and then you have to do the genealogy to see where the modern descendants are, and so on. I think that would all depend on the Pitcairn family being very curious about this, and my impression is that in fact they're not. That they would prefer their ancestor be honored and left in peace wherever he is.
All right, so our next question, did you need to be a member to be buried at Christchurch? I understood he attended services there despite the Sons of Liberty prayed there too. I mean, that's one I guess I can answer as well if you want to jump in too, John. Typically, I think people in the 18th century who were buried at Old North were members of the church. We don't necessarily have any records of Pitcairn worshiping at the church. That doesn't mean he didn't. It just, we don't know for sure. I think as you mentioned, John, we assume he was buried there because it was close by and he was the same faith as the church. Did you want to add in on that?
There were three Anglican churches in Boston before the Revolution: King's Chapel, Trinity Church, and Christ Church. And so, for anyone in the Church of England or Church of Scotland, that would be the place to standard place to go. The burying grounds, including the ones just outside King's Chapel, the one at the Common, the one in the what we now call the Granary burying ground, those were civic, town-owned spaces, and those were open to anybody. There was limited space in a crypt, so it was an honor to be buried there. It could even be said to be expensive, I think so. But I believe that because of the expediency, the necessity of burying, and because of the honor of dying in this battle, they were being put into the congregation might have been willing to bend the rules for these officers. I just saw a comment from Liz saying Church of Scotland was Presbyterian. That's true. The Presbyterian meeting houses were even fewer than the Anglican meeting houses.
And I'll just add one more thing that my colleague Catherine just reminded me of, was that the church does have a stranger's tomb. It dates from 1814, but stranger's tomb would have been for any non-members of the church. So it does suggest that it could have happened from time to time that non-members were buried at the church. All right, we've got some more questions here. Another one: were other British officers interred in Boston? I thought most of them would have been taken back home to their family.
Many others were, as this description of the church tomb was, and we see burials, a handful of burials through King's Chapel and through Trinity Church. The Colonial Society of Massachusetts has published those records. There really wasn't an easy way to preserve bodies at this point, so it was actually quite rare to send one all the way over. I think, in fact, when Dr. Winship sent Major Pitcairn over to London, the fact that probably a lot of the flesh had decayed at that point made it an easier task. It was pretty standard for both British officers and definitely British enlisted men to be buried near where they fell, rather than shipped all the way back to Britain.
All right, another question. Winship tried to snatch the royal governor's box. What year was that? I thought you said it was 1787, which is after royal governors were around.
Yes, Winship became a warden in 1787. He tried to get the box. He tried to get the pew in 1790. That had been, as I said, he was reserved for the royal governor. There was no royal governor. That's probably why he thought it was, he might as well take it, because nobody else is using it. Presumably, any governor, which in that period meant John Hancock, could have come and used it. But Hancock had his own church in Brattle Square or meeting house, and preferred that, I'm sure. So I think Winship was probably looking at this and saying, well, why not? Nobody else is using it. So yes, it was originally for the royal governor. There was no royal governor. There it was.
Since General Thomas Gage was a member at Old North Church, it would seem he would have written about it, maybe? Have you found anything written by Gage about Pitcairn's burial?
Okay, Gage worshipped at Old North, but he also worshipped sometimes at King's Chapel. His official residence was what was called the Province House, which is sort of in the center of town, and therefore, actually, I think going to King's Chapel was more of a hike. It wasn't that difficult, but it was like a quarter mile away instead of 200 yards. I Gage didn't really. I've looked at his papers for other things. That's not the sort of thing that he writes about.
All right, so someone else said, loved your use of voices as you read to us. It added some dramatic flair. Thanks for this interesting presentation. I have to agree. I loved the voices. I think it really brought all of the different these historical characters to life.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I shied away from doing a Scottish accent for Major Pitcairn. I wasn't sure about that one.
Do you know where the where the barracks housing the British soldiers in the North End was located?
Um, Not off the top of my head. What the British Army did at this time, both when they arrived in 1768 and then when they came back in 1774, is that they rented warehouses, storehouses, some distilleries which were not doing good business, large buildings that they could get from the owners, from merchants and other business people, and uh, converted them into barracks. There was also an attempt in late 1774 to build barracks on the common, which was the locals tried to stymie that by basically having a boycott of goods and services. This was so there are sort of general statements that, oh, they rented a building on this street, or they were on the common until November. But I'm unable to say, okay, this modern address is where the barracks were.
All right. Another question. So if the Pitcairn pistols turned out to be Crosby's, what happened to Pitcairn's pistols captured at Lexington? Or did Pitcairn keep his pistols?
The pistols that people thought had been captured from Pitcairn were Crosby's pistols. We can't even say. I mean, I assume that Pitcairn carried pistols, but he kept them, and his horse was wounded, but he did not. I don't think he lost his horse. I don't think he lost his pistols. Crosby did, and so we've just had to. We've spent then 200 years thinking of them as the Pitcairn pistols, but we really should think of them as the Crosby pistols all along.
Thank you. I guess I have one more question. If anyone has any other last questions before we wrap up, please feel free to put them in the chat. But I guess my question I had is that you talked a little bit about the very negative perception that Americans had of Pitcairn, especially following Lexington, that he was, profane and aggressive. From your research of Pitcairn, do you think that was a deserved impression of him?
It's an interesting. His public persona has undergone some different changes, and this is a part of the Ghost that I decided not to go into more deeply. But in the first decades, he was really this villain. He was this profane villain who was brought low, and then and we see in people like the Elliots sort of pushing back and saying, well, he wasn't really that bad. Or yes, he was fiery and profane, but he was respectable enough. And then in the late 1800s, starting with a man named Charles Hudson, who wrote a history of Concord, there was an attempt to sort of rehabilitate him. And Charles Hudson wrote a paper for the Massachusetts Historical Society called The Life and Character of Major Pitcairn, which sort of, it doesn't actually say much about his life or his character. It just says that he is not deserving of being such a villain. And then Esther Forbes, in her book, Paul Revere and the World He Lived in, she really pushes this argument that he was actually popular among the Bostonians, that they respected him, and they even liked the fact that he swore a lot. That was something that was actually they grudgingly admired in some way. And I think that's going too far. I think that seems to be just sort of pushing back against this villain. I don't think he was a villain. I don't think he was either popular. I think he was sort of a standard British officer who, as a gentleman, was, admired by other gentlemen. Most popular with people like the Elliots, who might get to know him more, but really not well known among other people. He did not show up, as I say, in these sources like John Rowe and John Andrews' writings. So I don't think he is, being a social fixture around the town. There are occasionally some British officers who are much more visible in those sources among the civilians, and it looks like Pitcairn sort of stayed by himself. So I think that he was just a standard officer, and we have this. We've been going this pendulum of he is such a villain, and then he is actually such a good guy. Maybe the truth is sort of more moderate. It is interesting to read Esther Forbes's books, both Paul Revere and the World He Lived In and Johnny Tremaine, which are terrific books, and think about how they were written during World War II, when we were supposed to be friends with the French and the British and everyone together. And you can really see that theme coming through with how it treated how those books treat the ordinary British soldiers.
A good point. I think, yeah, probably makes sense about Major Pitcairn too, that maybe he fell somewhere in the middle. All right, it looks like we've got two more questions here. So the first is, where were the American dead at Bunker Hill entombed?
They were stuck in holes in the ground. I mean, that is literally the way the British officer in charge of the burial detail called it. If you lost the battle, you were not getting any sort of honors. So and even he buried, or he oversaw the burial of Dr. Joseph Warren, who was recognized and was clearly dressed well, and so he was recognized as the leader of the opposition. They'd stuck him in a hole. Then they dug him up the next day to show the British commanders that, yes, this really was Dr. Warren, stuck him back in a hole with one other man. And then after the British left in 1776, Warren's family went out, dug him up again, brought him over to Boston, had a big public funeral at King's Chapel, which King's Chapel is going to be recreating next year, and then put him into the family tomb. Most of the men, the provincial men who died in the Battle of Bunker Hill, are probably still buried on and around the battlefield in Charlestown. They were probably not dug up because their families would not have had the resources to do that.
All right, and then our final question of the evening: the colonists seem to have a more favorable opinion of Lord Percy. What was there a reason for this?
Possibly because he was a lord, because he was, heir to the dukedom of Northumberland, and he was, I think, probably the highest ranking British aristocrat in Boston at the time. So you wanted to be nice to him, and he was a perfectly good, pleasant gentleman of that sort. Like Pitcairn, like most of the other British officers, his private letters back to Britain were very uncomplimentary about Bostonians and about the whole situation, and about how it should be easy to quell this rebellion of these ungrateful people. So I think that there were a few British officers who got a very bad reputation because of things like tarring and feathering a farmer from Billerica, or back in 1768, suggesting that the enslaved people could revolt if they wanted to. Those were the notorious British officers. Most of them were sort of in the middle, normal, seen as, oh, isn't it nice to have classy people, classy gentlemen among us? And I think Lord Percy, being an heir to a dukedom, was the classiest of all.
Well, thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I think, Pitcairn is someone who we talk about at Old North, and certainly someone who, when people come to visit us, are interested in. And I think you've just shed so much light on kind of all the complicated stories surrounding his life. So this has been, I just think, such a wonderful talk for us, a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for coming out. I see some familiar faces in the chat, so good to see you, and keep cool, everybody.
Yes, very cool. We also dropped the link in the chat to our events page where we have more info about our future speaker series events coming up. Our talk in July with Dr. Alexandria Russell, and that's where we'll be posting more info about our fall events, including our book chat about Johnny Tremaine too, which you've already given me something to chew on, John, about the World War II context for that as well. So just thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.